I'll turn it over to you, Joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to do this and be here with you. And I want to ask, as a favor, anyone who is able to turn on their cameras. I'm unfortunately housebound by illness, so I'm starved for faces. But also, when I'm teaching, I feel like getting to look at people and see responses. Even if I can't make eye contact, really make eye contact, I can at least stare at your little box and pretend that I'm making eye contact with you. So if you're able to, and if it's comfortable for you, that would be wonderful. And let's see. So if you want to talk, use the raise hand button, and if I don't actually recognize you, then unmute yourself. Can they unmute themselves, Jessica?
I think that this should be able to. And also we've had a lovely offer from Joyce, who said that she'd be happy to be co-host and admit people and do some of that work while we're on this call together. And Joyce, that would be great. Joy, I think you're the one, because you're the host, you would need to enable her to do that. So it's Joyce G is her.
Okay, make co-host. Oh, this is my first taste of power as a host here, so okay.
You did it.
Joyce, now you are co-host. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me tell you a bit about what I'm thinking we'll do here together. I was so excited when I got the invitation to teach a class on the poetry of Kabbalat Shabbat. And I immediately realized that I'd never paid attention to Kabbalat Shabbat as poetry. I mean, I like paying attention to pretty much everything as poetry. It's to me, that's an invitation to do close reading, to really slow down and look at how language is working, which is hard to do. I think it's impossible to do when you're singing, for example, or when you're just being joyful, or when you're being carried away by communal spirit, or if you're praying. None of these are states that are conducive to what in poetry classes and literature classes we call close reading. Because in close reading, you're paying attention not only to what language is saying, but you're paying some attention to how it's saying it. And a lot of really interesting and often strange things happen when you slow down your reading process enough to notice how language is working. And obviously, if you are trying to daven and you read that way, the service is going to be over and you're still going to be in the opening pages of it. So it's not a very practical way of reading, but it's a way of reading that can open insights and depths that are very hard to recognize any other way. So in today's class, we're going to practice close reading, which is the basis of what I want us to be doing together. And but close reading is sort of the foundation, because when I was thinking about this, I thought, you know, there's better poetry than the Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy. I think the Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy is great. I love Psalms. But if we were just going to hang out and read poetry together, I would probably pick other poetry that would be more rewarding to this kind of literary focus. So we should be doing something that is specific to the kinds of texts that we're reading. And I realized that one of the things that I struggle with pretty much, every week, I struggle with Kabbalat Shabbat. I struggle with not the service, but I just struggle with receiving Shabbat. You know, it's supposed to be a huge transition. I always desperately need Shabbat. But I struggle to do whatever it is that's supposed to happen that really makes this incredible transition that our tradition teaches us from the daily consciousness and the daily relation to time to the Shabbat consciousness and the Shabbat relation to time. You know, there's a tradition that says that on Shabbat we get an extra soul. I'm not positive that I've ever gotten that extra soul. You know, a little embarrassing to admit it. I don't know. There is a tradition that um, we're receiving a divine presence, you know, in the form of a Shabbat queen, in the form of the Shekhinah, that in some way we're opening ourselves to a much more intimate relation to the divine. And then, of course, there's Abraham Joshua Heschel's wonderful idea that when when we receive Shabbat, we're entering a palace that's made of time. That Shabbat itself is like a palace in time that is a place where we can enjoy special intimacy with divinity and with one another, that we can be more fully human in it. For all of, you know, I love everything that I've read about what Shabbat's supposed to be, but darned if I know how to actually go through a Kabbalat Shabbat service and have any of those wonderful things happen. So I thought it would be worth exploring whether the texts that have been chosen for Kabbalat Shabbat, how do they prepare us to receive Shabbat? What do they do to enable this to happen? You know, I think singing is great, but you can sing any part of the liturgy and it can be great to sing. That's not specific to these texts. Why these texts? What do they do? How do they work? And I hypothesized that maybe if we close read some of these texts, if we learn to do that and slow down, and we pay attention to the positions that they put us in as we read through them. So we don't just sort of read them as being out there or let them be a blur, but we look at what happens inside us as we try to make sense of them. That maybe that will constitute a kind of spiritual yoga, a sort of stretching within us, forcing us to adopt different positions and perspectives on God, on humanity, on time, that will in some way help us stretch us out so that we can receive Shabbat. One of the things about close reading is I can, you know, I'm a scholar, I can close read till the cows come home. But what really makes it magic is when you do it with other people and it's like peeking into the consciousness of the person next to you. When we start comparing what happens inside us as we move through a text together. So it gives a feeling of communion, which is exciting in and of itself, but it also, I always learn that there are so many other ways to understand what's going on in a text than I would ever come up with, because different people are different. We bring different things to this. So I'm hoping that that you will do a lot of talking and sharing here, as you know, we're a largish group, but nonetheless, you know, I'm hoping that everybody gets a chance to share. And if you don't get a chance to share a comment in the class, because we're sort of doing this together, but we're also going to be trying to do some skills learning, so there will be moving things along at some points. But please put what you're thinking in the chat. And if you're wondering things, you can also put them in the chat. I will not be able to read the chat as class goes on, but thanks to Joyce, somebody will be reading them as the class goes on. And Joyce, I want you to feel free to, if you see a question or a comment that really, you know, needs to be attended to, I hope that you will unmute and let me know. Will that work for you?
Yes, thank you. I'm just
Thank you
off
so
video
much.
because I had an injury, so I can't be on video at this point.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okie doke. And I guess I would like to invite everybody to write a little self-introduction in the chat. Maybe you all know each other, but maybe something about your relation to Kabbalat Shabbat. Anything, like what your idea or experience of receiving Shabbat is, a specific anecdote that you've had, something that you particularly like or dislike in the Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy, um, or anything else that is connected for you with Kabbalat Shabbat, so we can start to compare notes on this and create a communal meaning um, of this thing. Yeah, the opening Psalms are awesome. Okay, so we are going to start by looking at the first chapter of Shir Hashirim. And I put a link to Safaria's kind of clunky translation in the chat. It's probably a good idea if we're all looking at the same translation while we do this, because it's otherwise it's hard to compare notes, because the translations of these texts are quite different from one another. And in fact, they're all interpretations. None of them are just strict translations. So at least if we're playing off the same page, that would be good. And you should all have also gotten.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're not seeing the link.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go up to the very beginning of the chat. There should be 2 links there. One from Rabbi Lenza.
It's not there at this point. We don't see. Not everybody sees it.
Okay. I'm gonna thank you. All right. I'm posting it. All right. So this is what we're going to start with, and this is where we're going to find the Psalms that we're going to talk about. Actually, we're going to go from Shir Hashirim to Yedid Nefesh, and then hopefully to a Psalm. Are there questions at this point before we? Oh, right. I was just starting to say about the handouts. Handout 1 lists some terms that I'm just going to be using a lot as we talk about this. They're not super complicated, but if I'm referring to conventional imagery and language, that is referring to the fact that sometimes it seems like every prayer says the same thing in slightly different ways. That the things that we're looking at are texts that don't prize originality the way modern American literature does. What they prize is drawing on a communally shared set of images and set of languages that have deep resonance and history to them, and the text rearrange them in different kinds of ways. But they are assuming that we will recognize that this is familiar, and that then we'll say, oh, well, this is the familiar thing about going up to Jerusalem, but it's a little bit different in this context, in this way. I also am going to be talking a lot about shifts, and that's just when what we think at one moment in reading through a text, suddenly we think something different. We're struck by something different. That's a shift. And the 3 other terms that are key to this is we're going to be talking about the speaker. At every moment, we're going to ask, who's talking in the text? You know, one of the things about written language is they're disembodied. So when you see an oral performance, you usually don't have to ask who the speaker is, like who's talking. You can usually tell one way or the other and distinguish them. But in a text, you just have these words on a page. So in American literature classes, we just assume that there's a speaker all the time and that we need to figure out who that speaker is and that the speaker may be different from one text to another. I also am going to say addressee because the speaker usually seems to be talking to someone. And so we need to figure out who is this voice talking to. Is it talking to us? Is it talking to God? Is it talking to somebody else? That is something that keeps changing in these texts. And the third thing is our perspective on, we got a speaker speaking to somebody. Where are we in this relationship? Are we looking at it from far away? Are we looking at it from up close? Are we identifying with the speaker? Are we identifying with the person being spoken to? So that's the reader's perspective. It's our perspective. All right. So does everybody have have Shir HaShirim up? Okay, good. Let's take a look at verse 5. I wanted to start here because Shir HaShirim, if you've ever read the Song of Songs, tried to read it straight through, it reads like a narrative that's been put through a mix master, which I think actually may have happened. It's very, very hard to tell in a lot of places who's talking and what's going on, and it jumps around all the time. I just thought we would start from a place that is where those issues are relatively clear cut. Yeah, so let's start with verse 6, and I'm going to read the first few lines. My mother's sons quarreled with me. They made me guard the vineyards. My own vineyard I did not guard. So what do we make of who's talking here? If you read the rest of it, this does, the I is speaking to maybe the daughters of Jerusalem, maybe there are other people who seem to come in and out here. But just from those lines, who does it sound like is talking to us? And what, if anything, can we tell about them? What are they telling us about themselves? Yeah, Sonia?
They're telling us, I mean, what stands out for me is the last line. My own vineyard I did not guard. They made me guard the vineyards. My own vineyard I did not guard. So they're telling us that they're in a subservient position, and in some ways, going backwards, my mother's sons quarreled with me. Well, who would my mother's sons be other than my brothers? So even one's identity, and then they made me do something. It was to guard the vineyards, and then my own vineyard I did not guard. So it's very sad, and it tells us a lot about the powerlessness and the position in relation to family.
That is awesome, Sonia. That's right. So when we're trying to make sense of who's speaking to us, who the speaker is, we need to do what Sonia just modeled for us. We need to look at what the voice is telling us about itself and its situation and see what we can make of it. It's in all of the texts in Kabbalat Shabbat, all of them. we get very fragmentary information about who's talking to us, which means that we have to, be detectives a little bit. We have to infer from what's there. Weirdly, if you read the whole chapter, it's still pretty hard to tell who the speaker is. And whether there's one or multiple speakers, it doesn't get that easier. But in this passage, it feels like there's a definite voice that's talking to us about a coherent situation. My mother's sons probably suggests, well, if you're not calling them your brothers, Lois, you just made a gesture. What were you thinking?
Stepbrothers?
Or half brothers? I mean, they're my mother's, right, my mother's sons, but you obviously don't feel like they're brothers. You're not using the B word. So
Maybe they're estranged.
yeah. The language that the speaker is choosing to use here, because there are other words that could be used, they suggest that there's a level of estrangement here. I don't know in your house if it worked this way, but like if my mother was angry with me, she might say to my father, do something with your child, and all of a sudden it's your child. We see that in the Torah. Sometimes God says to Moses, take care of your people, these are your people, you take care of them. So usually not a good sign in a relationship when you have that kind of distancing language when there are other alternatives. So that's a clue to what's going on. And if you went further, you might say, my mother's sons quarreled with me. Sonia was pointing out that there's a sense of powerlessness. You notice that is in what we would call the passive voice, right? Or it's not the passive voice, but the speaker is presenting themselves in a passive position. It's not I quarreled with my mother's sons. It's hard actually to have a quarrel when you don't have two quarrelers, right? So it is likely that the speaker is involved in the quarrel, otherwise it wouldn't be a quarrel. But the way the speaker puts it, it's like the speaker's being quarreled with and they're just doing nothing. So the speaker is portraying themselves as being passive, even in just the turn of phrase that they're using. That's reinforced by they made me guard the vineyards. So this powerlessness, I'm just being acted upon and I'm being ordered around. And then there's this it's one of the most poignant lines in the Song of Songs, which is not known for poignancy, honestly. It's known for its explicitly sexual imagery. Mostly it's what it's famous for, but this, my own vineyard, I did not guard. Suddenly, the speaker is center stage, not just the recipient of being pushed around by other people. What do we learn, or what do we glimpse of the speaker in that my own vineyard I did not guard? When you read that, do you think this is, in Northern California, somebody really has not been paying proper attention to their vineyard and they're going to have trouble come harvest time? Is this a figurative vineyard? Sonia, thank you. I want to see if somebody else has a take on this. And I'm going to ask you to use the raise hand button because I can't see everybody on one screen. So. Thanks, Jess.
Sorry, but I'm muted. So I was thinking in terms of the reflections of the week, and it's a closing out of the week. It's entering the weekend, and so I see it as a reflection on how we behaved and what we did or did not do, and during the week.
Oh, reading this in the context, not in the context just as like a book of the Torah, but as part of Kabbalat Shabbat.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, that's right. It is a moment of reflection. How many people here have sighed when Shabbat is about to come, where you have this moment of reflection? You're like, oh, I didn't do this, or, right? If there's a feeling of you're letting go, but it's not, you're not doing it because you just had your week came to a triumphant conclusion and now you're ready to let go and do something else. You're like, just looking back and you're like, yeah, it didn't do everything, didn't get to everything. That for me is pretty much every week. When this speaker says, my own vineyard I did not guard, part of what's poignant to me is it feels like she might, in context, it's likely that this is a female speaker. So I'm saying she, but it's not, you can't really tell exactly. Not in the English anyway. I think in the Hebrew it's it's gendered female. But it feels like it's about not maintaining your boundaries, not taking care of what's yours. You have a self. Adria, did you want to say? Yeah.
So I read this very much like a woman, and I feel very adolescent, and I would like shield my genitals. I definitely, my own I didn't guard. And I think of all those creepy girl experiences. It just, not that that was my whole experience of it, but that was a layer of what I took in as you read those words.
Mm.
It's not the whole picture. I wouldn't say that. It was interesting though.
Right. Well, actually, this gets to the whole shift thing. So when you do close reading, these close readings, they're not overall readings. You don't have to say, I think in Song of Songs, the speaker is mostly talking about creepy girl experiences. But you're saying, that's what I'm feeling here. That's what I'm hearing here, this kind of vulnerability. And you feel complicit in it. You should have done something. But did you really have power? Right? And so you have the guilt and sense of failure and shame and violation, but right, it's hard to resolve it. Absolutely. And there's a lot of this actually, the Song of Songs. It seems like this speaker may have been forcibly made part of a harem. So that sense of violation and boundaries and how they can get messed up in erotic power relations, definitely part of the poem. So that's what we mean by speaker, right? This is a pretty clear-cut example. It's actually a first-person speaker who tells us a bit about themselves, and we can make some guesses about who they are and how they're feeling as they speak these words. Somebody want to read the next stanza, verse 7?
I'm having trouble finding the place in this Sfaria.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did the link not take you to chapter 1?
I've
Oh.
been scrolling. I see Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat, and you didn't
Okay,
get
there were
Nefesh.
there were two links. One was Song of Songs, and the other was Kabbalat Shabbat.
I was using the link that let's see who put this in. Ellen Ratner.
Ellen put 2 links in, Marjorie, so take a look at the chat.
Yeah, the first one is for Song of Songs, and the second is the Kabbalah.
I am so sorry for people who've been living with confusion here. Don't live with that. Like, if you don't know what text we're looking at, immediately interrupt, unmute. Let's get on the same page, as we used to say in the age of pages. All right, can everybody find the Song of Songs chapter 1 now? Marjorie? Oop, you are muted.
I was saying I can read and I got muted.
Fantastic.
Which verse?
Verse 7, chapter 1.
Tell me, you whom I love so well, where do you pasture your sheep? Where do you rest them at noon? Let me not be as one who strays beside the flocks of your fellows. If you do not
Thank
know,
you.
okay.
Actually, we're just gonna stop there for a second. That was, you really put yourself into that. That was good. That was a dramatic reading of like a clunky translation too. So thank you. So now we have a speaker and we clearly have an addressee. In the first lines that we read, it's hard to tell if the speaker is talking to somebody. In context, she's probably talking to a group that she calls the Daughters of Jerusalem. But in lyric poetry, sometimes you just talk to yourself, right? There isn't always somebody who's there. There isn't always a dramatic situation. But here, the speaker says, tell me, you. So this is like the text is bonking us over the head and saying, now I am talking to someone. And we should immediately be asking ourselves two questions. One is this the same speaker? Because this is a disordered text. And there are, if you look at verse 8, if you do not know, O fairest of women, that is probably a different speaker than in verse 7. But it is worth asking, is the speaker the same in verse 7 as in verse 6? And if she is, if we think she is, we can't prove it, but if it feels to us like she is, does she feel the same? Like her attitude, her affect, her tone, her situation, does that seem the same, or has it shifted? Right? So here's one of the famous shifts that we're going to be looking at so much. We also want to ask, who is she talking to? So she's drawing our attention to the fact that she's talking to somebody. Who is she talking to? What can we tell about the addressee? And what can we tell about the relationship between them? So, yes, Kathy.
Well, it seems that she's talking to her lover. You know, I'm trying to get that. It seems like she's more empowered than the speaker before her. And I don't know what the sheep represent, because
I think they're actually just sheep.
I'm afraid to take it literally from what all you've been saying. Nobody's.
A boatload of shepherds and sheep in this poem.
What's that?
There's a lot of sheep and shepherds in this poem, and sometimes I think they're just sheep and shepherds, but
yeah, maybe so. But I don't know. It's a warm sort of feeling that you get from her, and like you feel like she loves the sheep, and you love the sheep, and you want to guide them with love, perhaps.
thank you. That is awesome. I want to highlight one of the thing that Kathy said at the first. She said, this speaker sounds more empowered. It might be the same speaker who is now in a more empowered mode, but we know that she's more empowered because she's giving orders. When a speaker starts telling somebody what to do, that is definitely a sign of a more empowered speaker. Tell me, you whom I love so well, right? I'm not going to take no for an answer here. And then, this is not a question I've ever asked my beloved, where do you pasture your sheep? But you know, if you're in a pastoral culture, it's probably important, because if you want to hook up and you don't know where your shepherd is pasturing their sheep, you could wander around for hours looking for them. So you might really want to know the answer to that question literally, even if the sheep do have mystical significance. Avital and then Marjorie.
Yeah, I would argue that she doesn't necessarily have power, but she does have some resilience in I'm getting like a sense of like possibly like either envy or discernment. And I would only say that the only thing she's trying to command is starting on line 4. Like I would say there's some snark in how she phrases her questions that feels empowering, but there's still no guarantee her questions are going to be answered, even like, and the things that she wants to be let done will be actually let done. It's, we don't know, like why should this person follow her, like answer her questions or follow her order?
That is really good close reading. And in fact, if you lean more into the situation, if we take this literally, if you in days before cell phones are saying to someone you love so well, where do you pasture your sheep? Then you clearly don't know where they are and they can't hear you. There's, like if they can hear you say, where do you pasture your sheep? Then it will be quite obvious where they're pasturing their sheep, because you'll be seeing this big herd of sheep and your beloved will be there. If they can't hear your question, they won't be able to answer it. And so Avital is saying, yeah, maybe she's empowered by speaking up and demanding this information, but these are questions that she does not have the power to get answered. Marjorie?
I mean, I'm a little biased because I have read the whole poem. So I mean, one thing that's cool about this is that even though this is supposedly written by King Solomon, it's not necessarily somebody who's of the nobility class. If it was written by King Solomon and it was, between a man and a woman, David had a male lover, so who knows? But all I get from the first paragraph we looked at is just a phase of love, like, I mean, I glanced at the paragraph or two before, and I know that they're talking about, hey, you're sweet and whatever. So it's admiring. So here it's just one of those moments. Don't stare at me, don't look at me too hard because I've been out there working, and hey, before this moment I've had to work and I haven't had a chance to focus on me, or it could mean my own sexuality. I didn't guard, I could have, I don't know, but this paragraph that I read, tell me whom I love so well. Hey, where do you hang out? This could be coded language. Where do you go to pasture at noon? And so where can we rendezvous? Let me not be like one who, gets lost, who strays, who gets lost in the flocks of your comrades. I want to find you. Let's make a date. So that's how I read it.
Yeah. And we've all been there. We're lost among flocks of sheep, multiple shepherds. We can't find the shepherd we're trying to hook up with. It's a real drag. It's a real problem. So the speaker does not want to have that. And as Marjorie was talking, I'm realizing she's telling us a lot about the addressee, who the you is, right? The you is clearly a shepherd here. We're taking this literally, which I want to do. The speaker loves, and I'm not positive what love love so well means. That could mean a bunch of different things, but it does sound a little bit like a romantic thing, that wistful tone of where do you pasture your sheep, where do you rest them at noon. So the addressee is a shepherd who is a working shepherd who's not there. And the relationship between them, in addition to the love, I would say they're not close physically, but they're also maybe not close in other ways, because this is somebody who doesn't know where you whom I love so well is likely to be resting sheep at noon, right? She doesn't know what the usual thing is here. So there's a affection, there's longing, but there's not a whole lot of knowledge of where the you is with those sheep right now. So the last question I want to ask, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sonia.
It also sounds a little bit to me, maybe this is reading in too much, but when the speaker says, "Let me not be as one who strays," she's imploring, in a sense. She's actually, again, putting herself, if it's the same person, then it's again, putting herself in a position of, as you say, longing, helplessness, pleading, "Let me not be as one who strays." In other words, she's asking for the shepherd to see her differently, I think. No, I'm not like the others who might not love you so well.
Oh, right. I'm not just another shepherd groupie,
Right.
one of those girls who just goes from flock to flock. Don't confuse me with that.
She's even asking for some guidance here, for asking this person whom she loves so well. And now it's occurring to me, is this God? But she's asking for this person, the shepherd whom she loves so well, to keep her along the path in the right place, and not straying, and not, yeah.
The Song of Songs, actually, if we could do, oh, I'm sorry, Joyce, I thought that we were going to 8:30.
No, just, it says to 8 o'clock.
Oh.
No, it says 8:30. Mine says 8:30.
8:30, 8:30.
8:30.
I think the original invitation said to 8:30, but the more recent notice said 7 to 8.
I'm sorry. It is an hour and a half class. If you can't stay, obviously, go when you have to. I'm sorry about that confusion. And in any case, Joyce definitely should be moving on. It's the problem with me as a teacher. I really get into each bit of text, and so sorry about that. I just want to say one other thing about these chunk of lines that we've looked at. The reader's perspective. When I read these lines, I see these from the outside. I'm listening to the speaker, I'm listening to what she says. I don't identify with her. I don't feel like I know her. When she talks to you whom I love so well, there are actually like love poems where if somebody says you whom I love so well, you could give that to somebody and know that they would see themselves as being the addressee. But here, I don't have a moment of that. I think, yeah, she's talking to somebody else who I also don't know about a situation that I don't know. So I'm outside, I'm looking at this from a certain kind of distance. For me, it's not a far distance. I feel pretty engrossed in the speaker and the situation, even though I don't really understand what's going on very well. So I don't feel like I'm looking at it, from high above or far away, but I'm clearly not part of this scene. This is about people and relationship that does not involve me. So that is the reader's perspective. perspective on this. And sometimes now I'd like us to turn to the other link, the Siddur, the Kabbalat Shabbat, and Yedid Nefesh should be the text that comes up for you. So in these texts, it's more complicated to figure out where we are in relation to the text and to what the text is saying. Even when we're not directly in the line of fire, sometimes we're drawn in close, sometimes we're far away. So that's another thing that we're going to keep account of. Yedid Nefesh is so beautiful when it's sung. And I've almost never read it in English. And since I'm not fluent in Hebrew, that means I just get carried away by this beautiful, haunting melody. But it's also quite a passionate, mystical love poem. And I'd like to look at it to zero in on some of these questions of speaker and addressee and how they change and where we stand in this. So would anybody who hasn't spoken yet, would anybody like to read the first paragraph? Christy.
Thank you. My soul's beloved, merciful Father, draw your surrendered to your will rendered. Your surrendered will run like a gazelle. He will bow before your splendor, for to him your love is sweeter than the dripping honeycomb and any taste at all. I'm not sure how far you want me to go.
That is a good place to stop. That is a different translation than I'm.
Oh, sorry, I'm on Safaria. Are we on Safaria?
We're on Safaria, but Safaria has a bunch of different ones. That
Oh, whoops,
link
sorry.
should have.
I can't
No,
quite,
no, it's not.
I can't quite find where you are in the text.
Okay, so that's a poetic translation. The translation that we were going to look at, and it's a really cool translation, actually. I'm looking at the Siddur Ashkenaz, Kabbalat Shabbat on Safaria.
Yep, sorry about that.
No. I just want to make sure everybody has got it. I'm sorry about
Marjorie
this.
just put it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Joyce. You get to talk also, like participate. You don't just have to do the work.
I have the right one if you want me to do the right one.
Okay, great. Why don't you read that, and you'll see it's a lot less beautiful and a lot easier to understand.
Yeah. Beloved of my soul, compassionate Father, draw me, your servant, to your desire. Would that I could run like a gazelle and bow before your beauty, for I find your love sweeter than honey or any delight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the Song of Songs makes it into some Kabbalat Shabbat services because there is a long tradition, rabbinic tradition, of reading it as an allegory of the love between God and Israel, or the soul and God, anything but reading it as a poem about sex and actual people and shepherds and things like that. But also because that feeling of love and longing and distance, there is something about that is like a keynote of Kabbalat Shabbat. And here at the beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat is a poem that is about longing for a beloved. Adria, I'm sorry, and how do I pronounce your name? I feel like I'm saying it wrong every time. Oh, great. Go for it.
Adria, like the Adriatic Sea.
Fabulous.
Okay. Excuse me for being so embodied. So is it so in heterosexual Jewish land that men and women make love on Erev Shabbat? Is that true? Isn't that like Friday night, they're supposed to make love? So is this
Yes.
read on Friday night, the Song of Songs?
Yes.
So
It,
imagine
yeah.
people who are heterosexual in couples that last for 40, 50 years or 20 years. And here's this erotic piece read on the night of coupling. It's kind of interesting culturally. Because you were saying, how come it got into the Shabbat service? And it's allegorical for God's love for Israel, and it's the welcoming of the bride. And. Just a thought.
Absolutely. And it, eros is that this erotic desire is the basis for all kind of, yes, it is sex positive. Judaism is pretty sex positive. There are a lot of rules around sex, but sex is seen as something that is good. It's supposed to be good. And it's, there's all religions want to channel eros, the desire that human beings have for intimate connection with other human beings. All of that is really eros, is erotic desire. It comes up in friendships, it comes up in teaching relationships. Whenever people are closely connected to each other, eros can be there. It's what draws us together, despite the fact that, folks get on our nerves, right? Like people are always at least a little bit annoying. If you're with them long enough, 40 years of marriage, definitely there may be some moments of irritation in there. But eros is what draws us to other people, even though they're different than we are and they rub against us. So when Kabbalat Shabbat is invoking it, absolutely, you're hoping that these happy couples go back and couple. But you're also trying to arouse this longing for connection and hopefully channel it in the direction of God. And that's why, Yedid Nefesh is right there to give us a speaker and an addressee that are clearly located within spiritual connection. So who is this speaker? Who's saying, "Beloved of my soul, compassionate Father, draw me, your servant, to your desire"? In this paragraph, what do you feel like we learn about the voice that's talking to us?
So father's an interesting word. And if I'm just going with my imagination. So I see it as a man talking to God is how I feel it. And I think, there is that whole, I don't mean this in a sexual way, but homoerotic, if you look at men praying in rooms to the male God and all of that, I mean, it's a masculine culture, it's patriarchy. I'm not being negative in this.
No, but the homophobia that is built into Jewish traditional culture has to do with the fact that there is so much eros among men that's part of traditional Jewish culture. There's very little anti-lesbian stuff in Jewish tradition because there's nothing in Jewish tradition that connects worship of God and men being all close together and communing with all of these intense feelings together. That there isn't a similar thing for women. There isn't a need to prohibit and regulate that. Is there anything in the language? I mean, what do people think? Is this a gendered speaker? Adria feels like it's a man talking. That could just be because she knows the context of the tradition that it comes out of. I'm sure it was written by a man. I don't have the notes open, but I don't have a doubt about that. But even if it's written by a man, that doesn't mean it's, go ahead, Fred, please.
Yeah, I'm using Lev Shalem, which had Shir HaShirim, and it was written by Eleazar Azkiri in the 16th century. So I presume in Sfat, but I don't know. That Eddie doesn't say.
What do you think? Do you think that this is a male voice?
Me?
Yes, just out of curiosity.
Could be, or it might not. I mean, it's an author. The voice of the poem doesn't have to be the author, right? Listen
That's
to
right.
Eminem, for example. I mean, if you want to.
Exactly.
Stark
The speaker
contrast.
of the text it's not, unless it's an autobiography, we don't assume that they're the same. But sometimes, if this said, beloved of my soul, compassionate Father, rub your beard against my beard, we might say, well, that definitely sounds like a gendered voice there. And in Shir HaShirim, there are gender indications that lead us to see the voice as female. So it's a question in this. Joyce?
So I was going to say that when I first learned Yidin Nefesh, it was in the context of an Orthodox shul, and the word was Mishoch Avdecha, not Avdach. So it does seem like there are these some of the words have been rewritten, just like in here as well. I think in one of the later paragraphs, I'm trying to think there's a song, Ele Chamda Libi, Husana Ve'al Natit Alem, and we don't say that. We say Ana Eli Mahmad Libi. So those words have been rewritten.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Joyce, for those of us who don't know Hebrew, can you just explain a little bit more the changes?
Can I just say, in the text I put in the chat, the text in English has the female in those lines. It's in the second stanza. There's you can see, it says, it starts with beautiful. And the second sentence is, God, please heal her. And the antecedent of her is my soul. Please heal her by bathing her in your serene light. Then she shall surely be strengthened. Sorry for jumping.
No, thank you. So one of the things is that in a poem, as Fred was reminding us, the speaker doesn't have to be identified with the author. And when a first person speaker doesn't actually have to be defined by gender. But as Marjorie was pointing out, in the second stanza, there is a gendering, but it's not the gendering of the speaker, it's the gendering of the soul. And that's a convention, right? That's a tradition that says whether you're male or female, your soul is female in relation to God in particular. So it's not about what we would call gender identity, but it's in this, sort of the projection of heteronormativity onto the metaphysical universe. Then you say, well, God, if God is your love object, God is supreme, God has to be identified with the male. And so you, in relation to God, longing for God, whether you're male or female in the human world, you're female in relation to God. You're in that, and so that must mean your soul is female. And so that's what the speaker is kind of doing here. Lois?
Thanks. I think what I find enigmatic here is the word draw me to your desire, ritzon ha. And I'm curious what other people think about it. Is it draw me so that you, God, Father, will desire me? Is it so I will desire you? Is it so we will desire each other? So that word, your desire, I'm curious about.
Those are great questions. And the question that raises the question of what is the relationship that the speaker is setting up with God? Because one of the things that a first person speaker who's addressing God has is absolute power to set up the relationship to God. If you're doing all the talking and God doesn't get a word in edgewise in this poem, we long for God, but God doesn't say anything here. So the speaker gets to create the relationship. So one of the questions is, what is this relationship that's being set up that's defined by desire? Another question is, how does the speaker define God? Who does the speaker think they're talking to in setting up this relationship? How do they imagine God as they talk to God? Avital and then Kathy.
I interpret it as that they're asking for like a medium between them and God to like explain what God would want as a desire from the speaker.
Hmm. So draw me to your desire is really saying, make it clear to me what you want from me because I'm ready and waiting. You know, all you need to get me to do what you want is to tell me clearly what it is. Am I getting that right? Have you talked?
Yeah, I mean, it's just specifically this draw me your servant to your I mean, I guess the your servant could be I guess in like reading it now, it could be them referring it to yourself, but there's also really, I mean, the way I first read it, it was draw me like, I guess without a comma would mean draw me your servant and bring me a servant, but reading it and not noticing the comma, I interpret it as like bring me a servant to tell me what you desire. But I guess noticing that there's a comma there, it does make it seem that they are referring to themselves.
But you're drawing attention to one of the reasons. So one of the things is we want to figure out where the confusions are and then why do the questions come up? And you're helping us see that. It's because there are three different relations, three different ways of naming God, and three different relations to God in the opening clauses. First, God, you're the beloved of my soul, right? This is akin to the speaker of the Song of Songs and the shepherd, right? It's some kind of an erotic love relationship, right? The beloved of my soul. But then you're a compassionate father. And I don't know about you, but that was, beloved of my soul was not the relationship I had with my father. Those were two different kinds of relationships and two different ways of imagining God. And then there's your servant. So those are two ways of naming God, but then draw me your servant. Now the speaker is naming themselves and naming themselves as a servant, which is different than saying I'm your child, right? If this is my father I'm talking to, then I'm the child in this relationship. If it's my beloved I'm talking to, then I'm a lover in this relationship. So there are three different relationships to God and three different ideas of God that are all jammed together, which make it awfully hard to understand what draw me to your desire means. Kathy, and then Marjorie.
It is hard to say. Last thing you said, the draw me to your desire, or I can't go back to the thing because then I lose you. Or is it okay if I lose you and go back to this? So I want to get the exact wording. Draw me your servant to your desire.
Yeah, your will could be.
Yeah, and the line, my soul is sick with love. That that just makes me think about the state of consciousness of the speaker. My soul is sick with love. It's the kind of immersion in this emotion that it can be, could be a human emotion, but it could be divine emotion in a way too, which is a lot more expansive, a lot more powerful. And it's like the person is carried away, and the person is so overwhelmed by this this emotion, sick with love. I'm not saying I can understand what it means, but it just makes me wonder what it means for the person and for their relationship with the divine. I know that because it uses the father gender to I guess refer to God, then the other then the person in the relationship could be considered female, you know. But I also think that we need to start, when I say this, we need to start thinking of God as female. And so why not?
Absolutely. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Jerry Maguire, but the climax of the movie is, you know, this fairly inarticulate sports agent pouring out his heart to his love object, and then she interrupts and says, you know, you had me at hello, I think, right? Something like that. The very first word that he said. You know, God does not get a word in edgewise here. The speaker does seem to be overwhelmed with love and with feeling and with longing. We have no idea where God is in this, except we do know that God is at some distance from the speaker. That's the only thing that I feel sure of about draw me your servant, your desire or will, or however we want to translate that. Clearly there is distance. You know, for all of the intimacy of beloved of my soul, compassionate Father, your servant, all of these things suggest that they have an active relationship to one another. But there is distance that keeps being there. And the speaker is filling that distance with overwhelming emotion and a whole series of ideas of God and relationships to God. Marjorie, you've been waiting a long time. I know that. But Florence hasn't said anything yet. So Florence, Marjorie, and then Sonia.
Thank you. So I was going to say a lot of what you just said, that the relationship that's kind of the traditional God relationship of father and king, which is the servant, is that distance, but the beseeching transforms those sort of authority, higher, not close. There's this invitation to transform that relationship into a loving, caring, reciprocal relationship. So I see that there's a movement, or it doesn't actually happen yet, but there's this invitation on the part of the speaker to not just stay as a servant or a child. It's to have this love relationship.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. And a desire for it to be reciprocated. Marjorie?
So at first I was really resisting. I had Googled for some reason. I was looking up the word. I found another translation, and it reminded me that the word ratzon can mean will as well as desire. So I was like, oh no, this is like not sexual, blah, blah, blah. There is definitely the hierarchical relationship that there's somebody that's a teacher, a father, and I'm a servant, you know, over a servant. But you cannot deny that there is something in here that is like a desire by the speaker to have a sexual kind of relationship, because it says spread the sukkah of your, well, that isn't necessarily my lover.
I've never heard that
It
language
says
like that, spread like that before, I have to say.
it says my lover in the last paragraph. So that's, you know, ahuv. I mean, it could mean, maybe, well, actually ahuv could mean beloved. So, you know, it's possible. It's possible that this could just be, you know, hey, I love you, father, teacher, somebody who has a little bit more status than me. But the translator definitely of this one made it have some shade, like could I run like a gazelle before you? You know, like that's a little bit flirtatious. But
It's more than a little bit flirtatious, and even without the double entendre, because gazelle was like a sexual code word in medieval Hebrew poetry.
but there is, I mean, there is, I find your love sweeter than honey. I mean, it could be read in a very, you know, kind of straightforward way. You know, I have this love for my teacher, my father, or whatever, that's very strong. So, but the person who, the people that put this edition together and chose this translation wanted this in the two kinds of shades of love.
That's right. And Ritzonecha is really great because it can mean desire and it can mean will. And that's the ambiguity that Marjorie is pointing out here that runs through this, that there's such a hierarchical distance between God and the speaker, but there's also this intense erotic feeling. So there's both the authority and the power differential, but also this overflow of desire and love. Sonia, and then Jess.
There is something, I'm just focusing on the very last phrase, for I find your love sweeter than honey or any delight. I'm certainly in agreement with all the erotic aspects and the various ways that God is seen here, but I'm highlighting for myself, you know, there's that distance. Would that I could run like a gazelle and bow before your beauty. My image is that I'm running so fast to reach the beauty of God that, you know, it brings to mind how we do try to get ready for the Kabbalat Shabbat service. But to say, I find your love sweeter than honey or any delight, really speaks to the writer's experience of being loved by God, whatever that means. I don't think it's just, obviously it's not just sexual. I mean, there's an aspect, you know, because there's an aspect to our lives, as you pointed out, that's erotic aspect to our love, but and asking what God desires. I just also, the other thing that comes to mind, we've heard so many times from both Rolly and Felicia, that God, that our relationship is reciprocal with God, and God does desire us. But again, I just think to be able to say, I find your love sweeter than any honey or any delight, speaks to the writer's experience. Not, I mean, certainly there's the longing, but you only long for something you've had a taste of, and that's literally what this is about. I know I'm just saying this, the same thing that others are saying.
No, good. There's something that was really good, and one thing that is really helpful is, I find your love. You said, number one, that says the speaker has experienced this thing that they are longing for, this love that they're longing for. It's not just theoretical. And I don't know about you, but when rabbis tell me about God's love, that feels theoretical to me. That is different than actually feeling loved by someone. Honestly, for me, feeling loved by somebody can feel overwhelming. It can feel scary. It brings up all kinds of history and stuff. It's a very intimate thing. But when somebody says God's love or God loves you, I don't have any of those reactions. I'm just like, right, I've heard that before, you know, but I don't feel plunged into that. But this speaker is saying, I find your love, as Sonia is saying. That means like, I've experienced this. And not only have I experienced it, but I've reflected on it. This speaker has felt God's love and then gone to the kitchen and had some honey and been like, no, love's better than that. Maybe had some, you know, chocolate cake. God's love, by golly, is better than that. So it's love that is experiential, even on the level of taste, right? On the level of eating, it is not abstract or distant. And yet it's also something that the speaker is longing for. So it's not something that is continuous, right? It's like in a real relationship. Sometimes you feel close, sometimes you feel far. When you're really in love, you can drive the beloved crazy with the feeling of, always wanting to get that love from them, right? That's the state that this speaker feels like they're in there, just craving it. They're an addict, Jess.
Sorry, I always forget to unmute. I'm just thinking about the decision to put this in to the Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy, and how the how and the, and I don't know if this can even be answered, the how and the why. It's this particular passage. I mean, one can ask that of any point of the liturgy, but it seems that this one, which is so deeply personal and bringing up these very intimate things, it's like you start right off the bat with this. There's sort of no warm up to it. It's just boom. And whereas some of the other prayers in the liturgy, also the daily prayers, you kind of get warmed up a bit. I think of the morning service, you got some warm up prayers and then you get going and then you dive in. This is like a deep dive right away.
Absolutely. And it raises a question we have not talked about that much yet, but we're going to talk about it a lot at our next session, which is what's our relation to what's being enacted before us? I don't feel identified with the speaker exactly, but I feel uncomfortably close. This is really intimate language that I'm overhearing. It feels like, this is somebody who is in the middle of a passionate declaration of love to someone. And for some reason, I'm also in the room, standing right nearby. Like I can feel little bits of spittle, now and then from their mouths because they're speaking so passionately. So I feel like it plunges us right in the middle of this, and it doesn't really let us go. And also it doesn't give me any comfortable place to stand in relation to it. When I read this, I feel like it's saying, challenging me to identify with the speaker. Like, why, Joy, are you not feeling this way? Why don't you have this kind of good sex with God? Or this kind of, why aren't you in love with God in this kind of way? But it doesn't allow me to just identify with the speaker. So Lois and then Joyce, who's been very good about reminding me about how we're burning through time. Thank you.
I'm not sure how my comment is going to fit into the picture you've just drawn, but I see a little bit of distance looking at the Hebrew, because there's the third person. It's not would that I would run like a gazelle. In other words, literally, it's drawn. Okay, Mishoch Avdecha el Ritzon Nach. Draw your servant to your will. And then the next verb is not in the first person. The gazelle, it's not the I will run like a gazelle. It's your servant will run like a gazelle. This is third person masculine, Yarutz. And then Yishtachavet. He will bow. What's that? He will bow before your beauty because it will be pleasing to him. What will be pleasing to him? Yedidu tach, which is the same word as yedid at the beginning, for your friendship or your love, whatever we want to say, will be more pleasing to him, okay, than honey or any delight. So I know, formality, certain kinds of formal language use third person instead of second person, right? For you, thou,
yeah,
he.
Absolutely.
So that might be what's going on here, but I think it does introduce a little distance in using the third person singular. It's not the first person all the way through. That's all I'm trying to say.
No, that completely changes it. That is a perfect example of translation as interpretation. That is really, if this said, if this was in the third person here, I would be saying to you, why is the speaker talking in the third person? What are they talking about? You know, if they just had a dissociative break, you know, what, like, it would completely transform it. So thank you for pointing that out. Joyce?
So I was going to say that it is sort of a prelude to before we do Lecha Dodi, which then is talking about our beloved relationship with God. And the word Shekhinah has not come up here during this time, but I was thinking about that in terms of while we sing Yedid Nefesh. And we have, at BJ, we have a few different melodies that we use. We don't just use a slow haunting melody. Sometimes we do a faster melody. Sometimes we even start with the third paragraph, Higalena, or is it the last paragraph? One of the later paragraphs. We don't even do the entire Yedid Nefesh.
Interesting. Thank you. Marjorie, I know, I'm sorry, what, Joyce?
I'll be really quick.
We are at the 2-minute mark. It's 8:29.
I can be really quick.
Okay, super quick.
I just Googled 2 articles. One, this Britannica thing says that when Jews were, this is considered piyut, which is a type of liturgical poetry. The Britannica reference says that this religious poetry met strong opposition, and it was a way when the Jews were in Babylonia, but it was a way to disguise their religious love. I don't know if that would apply to this because this was written later, but the Wikipedia article about piyutim, which I don't use Wikipedia as a trusted source because it has varying degrees, but it says that there was controversy, and certainly Rabbi Matalon is an expert on this. But so this article says there was controversy about whether piyutim should be incorporated or not, and there was tension between Sephardic and whatever.
Marjorie, thank you so much. I'm sorry, we're running out of time and I have to talk about the upcoming class. But thank you. So for next time, we're going to be talking actually about Psalms, which are very different than either of the texts that we talked about today. In my fantasy, we would have talked about Psalm 95. So that's what we're going to start out with. And I would also like you to read Psalm 97, Psalm 98, and Psalm 92. And as you're reading, I'd like you to practice paying attention to who the speaker is. So this is a different kind of reading than stepping out and saying, well, what is this saying overall? And what's the historical context? This is really like, who's talking to me here? Who's talking to me here? Who's being spoken to? Is it me being spoken to? How are those things changing? And if you have a hard copy, and you can actually mark that up. And also pay attention to places where you feel pulled close to the text. Either you feel like you're being directly spoken to, reader, do this, or you feel like you're being included in a collective we, or you feel like in some other way you're like, maybe you're not part of the action, but like what I was saying about Yedid Nefesh in this translation, you feel like you're very close to it. And where do you feel far away? Where do you feel less engaged? Where do you feel like you're saying, oh, well, the speaker's talking like this, and they're talking to so-and-so, that kind of stuff. So we're going to try to be tracking that, and we're going to try to do it in a way where we enact those shifts within ourselves. Like that's the spiritual yoga part of it, is not just noticing what the shifts are, but actually feeling them as we move through the poem. At least that's the theory. We'll see if it works in practice. But I want to thank all of you. Fabulous comments and reading and contributions. It's been a real pleasure. And I know it's a little early, but Shabbat Shalom. I'm looking forward to next week.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
See
you.
you next week.
Have a
Thank you.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Refuah Shlema, Joy and Joyce.
Thank you. Yeah, Joyce.
I
Wounded
love all
and-
those of you who know that Hebrew. Oh my God, and go into the parts of speech. Lois, I'm sorry you're not going to be here next week. It's such a gift. Marjorie, I love it. Ah,
I know. You guys
This
could
is-
record your remarks and email them to us.
it's like, it's so not in my world. It's like, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Wonderful contributions.